Little girl saves a man on the street. His secret identity changes everything. The winter sun was shy that morning, barely daring to rise above the row of tired rooftops, spilling a pale golden light over the empty street, the kind that made everything look still and frozen. A sharp wind whistled between the buildings, carrying with it the bite of December's breath as Lily, only 9 years old, walked with small, determined steps, her shoulders tucked into her faded coat. The coat was too thin for the cold, but she hugged herself tightly, trying to trap in the warmth, while the backpack on her shoulders, scuffed and frayed, bounced with every step as though it shared her determination. The soles of her shoes were worn smooth, whispering against the frosty pavement, and she kept her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, though threads dangled where the fabric had worn away. Despite the cold, her eyes held a spark, the kind of bright curiosity that made her notice things others didn't. And she liked mornings like these. The world felt quiet, like a story waiting to begin. The main street was still half asleep, shutters drawn, shop signs swinging gently in the wind, and as she passed the bakery, she caught a faint whiff of bread, though the doors were still closed. She took a deep breath of the cold air, her breath rising in little clouds before her face, while a pigeon pecked at crumbs near the curb, flapping away as her shadow approached. Somewhere in the distance, a bus engine rumbled, slow and heavy, and her gaze wandered ahead to the empty bus stop at the corner. Only it wasn't empty. A tall man stood there, dressed in a sharp black coat that looked expensive, his dark hair neatly combed, his shoes polished, his presence almost out of place in this quiet street. He clutched a leather briefcase in one hand, glancing occasionally toward the road, as though waiting for something, while the wind tugged at his coat and he remained almost perfectly still. Lily slowed her steps, not wanting to be noticed, but something about the way he stood made her curious, too still, too rigid. And then he shifted slightly, as though trying to regain his balance. His other hand brushed against his forehead, and for a moment he swayed, the briefcase slipping in his grasp until it hung awkwardly from his fingers. Without warning, his knees bent sharply and he stumbled forward, one foot catching on the pavement, the briefcase tumbling from his hand completely. Papers spilled out in a sudden flurry, caught immediately by the wind, dancing in chaotic swirls of white against the grey street. A few landed against a shop's closed door, others skittered toward the gutter, and the man reached a hand out weakly, as if to catch them, but his fingers never made contact. His eyes seemed unfocused, blinking slowly, as though the world around him was fading, and Lily stopped walking entirely, frozen in place a few meters away, watching as his shoulders slumped heavily. His legs gave way beneath him, the sharp black coat crumpling around him like folding fabric, and he collapsed onto the cold pavement with a dull, heavy thud that echoed unnaturally in the quiet morning. The wind kept chasing the stray papers, unconcerned, and a single sheet landed near Lily's feet, its edge brushing her shoe. She looked at it briefly, but her gaze snapped back to the man, whose briefcase lay open beside him, the silver latch glinting in the pale sunlight. His hand was stretched toward it, unmoving, and she could see the steam of his breath, faint, almost invisible. No one else was around. The street felt suddenly emptier than before. A car passed at the far end, too far to notice. A shop curtain twitched, then stilled, and Lily's small fingers tightened on her backpack straps. The sight of someone falling like that was strange, frightening even, and she'd never seen an adult look so helpless. The wind picked up again, sweeping another sheet of paper into the road, and the bus engine in the distance grew louder, then softer, as it turned away. The man didn't move, his cheek resting against the cold pavement, a faint shadow of frost forming where his breath hit the ground, the cuff of his coat sleeve revealing a gold watch that glinted briefly in the light. Lily took one hesitant step forward, then another, her breath coming faster, the cold air stinging her throat. She glanced around again, still no one, and the stillness of the moment felt wrong, like the world was holding its breath. Somewhere above, a loose sign creaked in the wind. The smell of exhaust drifted faintly from a distant car, and a crow landed on a lamppost, watching silently. She reached the edge of the bus stop, standing just a few feet from him, and could see now that his eyelids fluttered weakly, but didn't fully open, his lips parting slightly as if to speak, but no words came. The sound of her own heartbeat filled her ears as she stared at his face, pale, drawn, not the kind she expected to see here. His hair slightly messy from the fall, one shoe scuffed from the stumble. The briefcase's papers continued to scatter down the street, his arm twitching once before going still. Lily took another step, her boots crunching softly on the frosted ground, hesitating with her small hands half raised, unsure if she should touch him, the cold air now sharper, biting through her coat, and in that frozen moment she realized she was the only one close enough to help. Lily's breath puffed in the air as she closed the last steps between them, her boots crunching faintly against the frost. Her knees hit the cold pavement without hesitation, the sting of ice seeping through the fabric of her leggings, but she didn't care. "Sir, are you okay?" she blurted out, her voice trembling more from worry than the winter air. His head rolled slightly toward her, but his eyes were only half open, unfocused, like he was looking at something far away. His skin was pale, the kind of pale that made her stomach knot, and when she leaned closer, she could hear his breathing, shallow, uneven, almost fragile. Lily quickly unwound the scarf from her own neck, the cold instantly biting at her skin, and slid it gently beneath his head so it wouldn't rest against the hard ground. Her small hands hovered uncertainly near his shoulders, wanting to help more, but unsure what to do. "Please hold on," she whispered, her voice softer now, almost like she was speaking to keep him tethered to the moment. The wind tugged at her hair, strands sticking to her lips, but she didn't move them away. She glanced over her shoulder, hoping to see someone, anyone, who might know what to do, but the street seemed reluctant to care. A man in a heavy coat walked by on the opposite side, glancing briefly before hurrying away, as though the sight was inconvenient. Another passerby slowed, frowned, and then kept going, their footsteps fading quickly. Lily's pulse quickened in frustration and fear. She raised one arm high, waving desperately at a figure emerging from a nearby shop doorway. "Help, please," she called out, her voice cracking under the urgency. The shopkeeper, a middle-aged man with a knit cap pulled low over his ears, froze for a moment, his gaze darting from Lily to the motionless figure on the ground. "He just fell," Lily blurted, her words tumbling over each other. The man stepped forward cautiously, glancing around as if expecting someone else to intervene. "I'll call an ambulance," he said at last, pulling a phone from his pocket and retreating slightly toward the safety of his shop's entrance. Lily turned her attention back to the man beside her, noticing how his chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven intervals. She wanted to tell him it would be okay, though she wasn't sure it would be. The faint sound of the shopkeeper's voice speaking into the phone drifted toward her, but the words felt distant, like they belonged to another world entirely. A gust of wind rolled past, carrying with it one of the scattered papers from the man's briefcase, which brushed lightly against Lily's leg before continuing down the street. She ignored it, her focus locked on the fragile rise and fall of the man's breathing. His hand twitched slightly against the pavement, the movement so small it was easy to miss. "You're not alone," she murmured, leaning a little closer, her voice almost lost to the wind. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, the sound echoing off the narrow street, and still no one else stopped. The shopkeeper stepped back toward her, phone pressed to his ear, murmuring something about the location and possible fainting. Lily bit her lip hard, willing herself not to cry. She knew if she started, it might make him feel worse, even if he wasn't fully aware. Her knees ached against the cold stone, but she stayed rooted there, one hand lightly resting near his shoulder in case he moved. She could see the condensation of his breath, thinner than before, and it made her stomach tighten with worry. The shopkeeper finally ended the call and looked at her. "They're on their way," he said, his voice more certain now. She nodded quickly, relief mixing with the fear that still clung stubbornly to her. "It's going to be okay," she whispered again, more to herself than to him. The wind carried away her words, but she kept talking softly, telling him that help was coming, that he just needed to hold on. Somewhere far down the road, a faint wail of sirens began to rise, but it was still too distant to be real comfort. The sirens grew louder until they filled the narrow street, bouncing off the shop fronts and cold brick walls, and moments later, flashing lights painted the morning in urgent red and blue. Paramedics rushed forward with practiced speed, patience eeling beside the man, as one of them gently moved Lily back a step. She stood silently, her scarf still beneath his head, watching as they lifted him onto a stretcher, the wheels clicking sharply against the pavement. Someone draped a blanket over him, tucking it around his sides, and just like that, they pushed him toward the waiting ambulance. Lily wanted to say something, anything, but her voice wouldn't come, her throat tight from the cold and from something heavier she couldn't quite name. The back doors closed with a metallic thud, and the vehicle pulled away, the sound of the sirens fading until it was just another piece of the city's noise. She stood there for a long moment after everyone else had left, the street returning to its indifferent quiet, her scarf gone with him. The rest of the day at school passed in a haze. She couldn't focus on the chalkboard or the teacher's voice, because every time she blinked, she saw his pale face and the way his hand had twitched faintly on the pavement. By the time the final bell rang, her decision was made, though she didn't fully understand why. She just knew she had to see if he was all right. She walked home quickly, stopping only to dig through the kitchen cupboard until she found a small paper bag and placed inside it the 3 tangerines her mother had bought at the market. They were bright and warm in color, a sharp contrast to the gray of the day, and though it was little, it was all she could give. The hospital was a long walk, but she didn't mind, her steps steady as the winter air nipped at her cheeks. The building loomed ahead, its windows glowing faintly as the early evening settled in. Inside, the air was warmer but smelled faintly of antiseptic and something metallic. People moved through the halls, some in wheelchairs, others speaking quietly to nurses. Lily clutched the paper bag to her chest as she approached the reception desk, her voice soft when she asked about the man from the street. The nurse frowned at first, glancing her up and down, clearly surprised at a child's question. "Are you family?" the nurse asked, and Lily hesitated, unsure what to say, then shook her head. I was there when he fell," she said quietly, almost apologetically. The nurse's expression softened slightly, though she still seemed unsure. For a moment, Lily thought she would be turned away, but then, after a quick call to someone down the hall, the nurse nodded toward a side corridor. "Room 214, just for a minute." Lily's heart raced as she followed the signs, her footsteps muffled against the linoleum floor. She paused at the doorway, seeing him lying in the bed, his black coat gone, an IV line running to his arm. His eyes were closed, his breathing steady but shallow. For a moment, she simply stood there, unsure if she should step closer. Then, as if sensing her presence, he stirred, his eyelids lifting slowly until they revealed a tired but focused gaze. His brow furrowed faintly as he looked at her. You were there," he said, his voice scratchy but carrying a note of recognition. Lily stepped inside, holding the paper bag carefully as though it might break. She managed a small smile, one that reached her eyes despite her nervousness. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay," she said, her voice gentle, steady in a way she didn't expect. The room felt still, like it was holding its breath for what would come next. The room was still when Lily finally left the hospital that evening, the paper bag of tangerines sitting untouched on the small table beside his bed. The air outside felt sharper than before, but she barely noticed, her thoughts tangled with the strange mix of relief and curiosity she carried home. That night, she lay awake listening to the muffled sounds of traffic outside her bedroom window, wondering if she'd ever see him again. Morning came with pale lights spilling through the thin curtains, and Lily was still rubbing the sleep from her eye. When the sound of an unfamiliar engine rumbled outside. It wasn't like the old cars that usually parked in their street. This was smoother, deeper, the kind of sound you felt in your chest. She padded to the window and peered through the glass just as a sleek black car eased to a stop in front of their worn apartment building. The polished metal gleamed even under the weak winter sun, and the driver, dressed in a crisp black uniform, stepped out to open the rear door. Her mother, still in her house sweater, frowned in confusion as the doorbell rang. Lily lingered by the bedroom doorway, watching as her mother crossed the small living room to open the front door. There, standing in the hallway, was the man from the hospital, but different now, transformed. He stood tall and confident, his posture straight, his black coat replaced by an elegant charcoal suit that seemed to fit him like it had been made just for him. The faint paleness she'd seen before was gone, replaced with healthy color in his cheeks. "Hello, Lily," he said warmly, his voice steady, his eyes meeting hers over her mother's shoulder. "I never got to thank you properly." Her mother blinked, momentarily speechless, before recognition struck her like a flash of light. Her lips parted, and her eyes widened in disbelief. Ethan Cross?" she breathed. The name seemed to hang in the air, heavy with meaning. Lily looked between them, confusion knitting her brow. "You know him?" she asked, her gaze shifting back to the stranger-turned familiar face in the doorway. Her mother swallowed, her voice almost a whisper. "Everyone knows him. He's one of the most powerful CEOs in the city. Owns half the skyscrapers downtown." The words felt strange to Lily's ears, like they belonged to a story she hadn't been told yet. She blinked, her voice small and uncertain. "You're important." Ethan's mouth curved into a gentle smile, his eyes soft with something that didn't match the sharp image she imagined a man like him might have. "Not as important as what you did for me," he replied, his tone carrying warmth that made the room feel a little less cold. The driver waited patiently outside, hands clasped behind his back, as if this visit was as natural as any business meeting. But there was nothing businesslike about the way Ethan stood in their small doorway. He wasn't rushing, wasn't glancing at a watch. He was simply there, as though this was the only place he needed to be. Lily's fingers tightened around the edge of the doorway, unsure what to say next. The morning light caught in his suit's fine stitching, glinting softly, but it was his gaze that held her still, steady, kind, almost grateful in a way she didn't understand yet. The hallway smelled faintly of cold air and polished leather from the car, mixing oddly with the scent of the tea her mother had been making before the knock. For a moment, no one spoke, the silence filled only by the hum of the car's idling engine outside. Then Ethan stepped forward slightly, his shoes making no sound on the worn floorboards. His presence filled the small apartment, not in an imposing way, but with a calm certainty, as if he belonged here more than the streets of glass towers her mother had mentioned. Lily studied him, still trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the fragile figure on the pavement the day before. Something told her this wasn't just a visit to say thank you. There was more behind his eyes, something unspoken but waiting. In the days that followed, Ethan became a quiet but constant presence in their lives. At first, his visits were brief. A polite knock at the door, a short conversation, and a promise to check in again soon. But as winter deepened, those moments stretched longer. He would sit at their small kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea that Lily's mother insisted on making for him, and listen with an attentiveness that felt rare. Lily, shy at first, began to speak more openly in his presence, telling him about school, about the drawings she kept tucked in a worn folder under her bed, and about the dream she'd carried for as long as she could remember, to become a doctor. Ethan would nod as she spoke, asking questions that made her eyes light up, never rushing her, never treating her words as the idle dreams of a child. In turn, he learned about the quiet struggles her family faced, the rent that was always due too soon, the repairs to the apartment that never seemed to come, the way her mother worked long hours just to keep the basics covered. He never interrupted with solutions or pity. Instead, he listened as though every detail mattered. As the weeks passed, the snow came heavier, settling over the city in thick, soft layers, and one afternoon the flakes fell slow and steady outside their window while a warm glow filled the kitchen. Ethan arrived that day without his usual driver waiting at the curb. Instead, he carried a small leather folder under his arm and the same calm expression he always brought, though there was a hint of something more in his eyes. After a few minutes of conversation, he reached into the folder and withdrew a long, cream-colored envelope, placing it gently on the table in front of Lily's mother. Her hands hovered above it uncertainly, as though afraid to touch something so pristine. "Go on," Ethan said softly, his voice warm but firm. She slid her finger under the seal, unfolding the papers inside, and as her eyes moved over the words, they widened in disbelief. It was a full scholarship, every expense, every year, for Lily's education, from where she stood now all the way through university. The paper trembled in her hands as she looked up at him, unsure if she was reading it right. Before she could speak, Ethan reached into the folder again and produced a small silver key, placing it beside the envelope. "And this," he said, nodding toward it, "is for your new home. A safe neighborhood close to good schools." Lily stared at the key, the metal catching the light in a way that made it seem almost unreal. Her mother opened her mouth to protest, but Ethan shook his head gently. "This isn't charity," he said, his tone steady, but carrying a depth of sincerity that filled the room. "It's my promise. The world needs more hearts like hers." For a moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the wall clock and the muffled whisper of snow outside. Lily's mother blinked hard, her fingers curling protectively around the key as though afraid it might vanish. Lily didn't know what to say. The weight of the gesture felt bigger than the room they were in, bigger than she could put into words. Ethan leaned back slightly, not looking for thanks, simply watching their reactions with quiet satisfaction, as though he had been waiting for this moment from the very beginning. The years that followed unfolded like pages in a book neither Lily nor Ethan could have imagined on that snowy afternoon. The small key had unlocked not just a door, but a life of possibilities, and Lily stepped through it with determination that never faltered. She studied late into the night, her desk light burning while the rest of the world slept, her notebooks filling with careful handwriting and diagrams. There were challenges, exams that seemed impossible, nights when the weight of expectations pressed heavy on her shoulders. But each time, she would think back to the moment Ethan had placed that envelope on the table, and her resolve would harden like steel. Her mother's smile on the day they moved into their new home was etched into her heart, a reminder of the why behind every effort. Ethan, though never interfering, appeared at key moments. A quiet figure at the back of the crowd during her science fair, a folded note of encouragement slipped into her hand before an important test, a familiar voice on the phone when she needed to hear that she could, in fact, keep going. Time passed, seasons turned, and the shy little girl with the frayed scarf became a confident young woman in a crisp white coat. And then, one golden afternoon, the culmination arrived, her graduation day. The auditorium hummed with voices, the scent of fresh flowers mingling with the faint scent of polished wood. Rows of graduates in black gowns waited nervously, their caps tilted at proud angles, and at the far end of the stage, a podium stood ready. Lily's name was called, and as she walked across the stage, her steps steady, the applause swelled. She turned to face the crowd, the bright lights warming her skin, and began her speech with a voice that carried both grace and strength. She spoke of early mornings, of persistence, but most of all, of a single day long ago when fate had intervened. "One cold morning," she began, her eyes scanning the sea of faces, "I helped a stranger." There was a pause, a hush settling over the crowd. "And that stranger changed my life. But the truth is," her voice softened, yet somehow carried even more power, "kindness changes both people. In the audience, near the front, Ethan sat with his hands clasped tightly, a proud smile breaking through as tears glistened in his eyes. The years had lined his face, his hair silvered, but in that moment, he looked younger, lighter, as though the weight of the world had been lifted just by hearing her words. Around him, the audience leaned forward, drawn into the truth she spoke. She closed her speech with a conviction that rang like a bell. Some encounters are not accidents, they're destiny. The hall erupted into applause, a wave of sound that seemed to carry her back through every moment that had brought her here. Standing on that stage, Lily felt the truth of it settle deep in her, that a single act, born in a moment of instinct and compassion, had set two lives on a path they were meant to walk together. And in the crowd, Ethan knew it too.